One could say that the influx 15 or 20 years ago of new software and ideas into the design fields met two rather different responses when they encountered the disciplines of architecture and that of landscape architecture. For architecture, there was a revitalization in all senses of that word of its quest for an animate architecture, references to biology as a source for ordering, and a corresponding expansion of the repertoire of design and concepts. Most recently, such tools and concepts have been mobilized to develop an architectural response to ecological performance. In landscape, which after all always works in the most direct way with the animate and biological events to which architects often appeal, one has seen a rather different mobilization of these same technologies of electronic production and reproduction to produce landscapes ordered by notational processes, pixelated gradient geometries, and photorealistic collages that wear their artifice on their sleeves. This turns the synthetic graphic expanded both the design repertoire of landscape and the production of designs that no longer sought to appear as if they were natural or rationalizations of nature, but sought soft control with natural events and natural processes. It was also a key part of the recalibration and retooling of the discipline to engage an expanded field of engagement with the contemporary metropolis. As graphic systems, natural processes and urban processes are unlocked from their pole positions within classical modernism and are hybridized and intermingled as a new sort of commons for contemporary culture. Amidst this flux, Chris Reed's firm, Stas Landscape Urbanism, has produced a distinctive body of work exploring the design of a performative urban surface. Throughout the work, this thick surface is developed as a site for the mapping of relationships between heterogeneous processes and the often and typically hidden infrastructures designed to manage these processes. This surface then becomes a new sort of non-figural figuration of forces and designed as a platform for the amplification of hybridity and events in our contemporary world. In its short 9 years of existence, this Boston-based office has produced a range of international projects that includes waterfronts, reclamation projects, interstitial sites in the suburban expanse, and vast infrastructural scale proposals in the middle of cities. These projects have been published widely, including the books Landscape Urbanism Reader, Manufactured Sites, Constructed Living Systems, and in journals such as 306090, Metropolis, Architecture Boston, Praxis, Center, Topos, and Land Forum. A monograph of the work has just been published in a volume by C3 Publishers. Chris holds degrees in urban studies from Harvard and a master's in landscape from University of Pennsylvania. Before founding Stas, he worked at Hargreaves Associates, and as a registered landscape architect, Chris also teaches in the Harvard Graduate School of Design and has in the past taught at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Toronto, Rhode Island School of Design, among others. Stas has been named a finalist and winner in a number of international competitions, including the Erie Street Plaza in Milwaukee, the Lower Dawnlands in Toronto, and the Safe Zone Garden installation at Grand Métis, Quebec. Most recently, Stas was honored by being named one of the 2 finalists in the landscape design category of the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt Museum's National Design Awards, and was named in 2008 as an emerging voice by the Architectural League of New York. His proposal for the Lower Dawnlands of Toronto received a planning award from EDRA, Places, and Metropolis. Among their current projects, they are collaborating with the Renzo Piano Building Workshop on the Isabella Stewart Garden Museum Edition in Boston, and supervising the construction of 2 major projects currently underway, the Fox Riverfront in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the Bass River Park in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So we look very much forward to Chris's presentation and thank him for weathering the weather in our event landscape of Houston. Thank you.
No. Excellent. Is it on?
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. Unfortunately, I missed most of the weather. I sort of trundled in on the back end of it and was really hoping to experience one of Houston's very well-known, very large weather events and flooding events. I was very excited, but I got here too late, apparently. I missed it. Damn. Next time. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, Rice has always occupied a particular place in design academia, if you will. Very much known for theoretical, high-quality, probing kind of work that's gone on and on here for a number of years. And so it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you folks and to be included in what's happening. I want to dive right in. I'll give you a brief introduction that frames some of the work that we do. As Christopher says, I'm trained as a landscape architect. I practice as much as an urbanist, as a landscape architect, and yet we are constantly looking beyond the field of landscape, beyond the field of architecture, for ways to think about the world. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about the ways we think, and then show you about how we test some of these ideas in both the theoretical work we do in the practice, as well as some of the work that's slowly being realized. So we're a research and design studio that's built its core practice around a set of hybridized design and planning strategies known as landscape urbanism. This positioning within a field itself, a hybridization of landscape architecture and urbanism, enables both a critical and a pragmatic broadening of landscape agendas, moving beyond simplistic visual and decorative approaches to landscape improvements, or landscaping, to those capable of addressing more far-reaching issues of infrastructure and function, ecology and sustainability, flexible programming and interim use, fiscal strategy and funding, and administration, management, and maintenance. For us, projects must be conceived and positioned relative to large-scale geographical, environmental, and infrastructural systems, no matter if the landscape in question is small or large. Projects must tap into the evolving dynamics of ecological and civic or social systems in order to remain healthy and resilient. And projects must set up conditions for a wide range of uses and appropriations, for both those we can imagine now and for those we cannot, in order to be viable immediately and for years to come. To achieve these ends, we favor a performance-based approach over one that is primarily physical, spatial, or visual. We're especially interested in how landscapes work, how they function urbanistically, socially, hydrologically, environmentally, how they reinforce existing city frameworks, and how they invent new ones, and how they may support a range of complementary and sometimes contradictory civic programs across a multifaceted, layered, and thickened urban field. Now, underlying our work, underlying our thinking, are a series of ideas that revolve around new models of ecology that have emerged in the past decade or two. When I was in school learning ecology, we learned that ecosystems essentially try to achieve an equilibrium condition, a steady state condition, that if you have a lightning strike in the forest that fells a tree, the forest will simply try to go back to this ideal condition. Those ideas about ecology have been thrown out. Currently, healthy ecosystems are considered ones that are constantly in states of change, that are constantly responding to changing inputs over time. So the more flexible, the more adaptive an ecosystem is, the better chance it has of survival. In the design fields, Nina Marie Lister's been one who has pioneered some of the new ideas in ecology and has worked closely with a number of design teams here working with field operations at Downsview Park in Toronto. She's also collaborated with my firm and a number of others. And this is sort of one of the early classic diagrams about successional ecosystems, that if you plant a few seeds, start with a couple bugs, in just a couple years you can get frogs and owls and eventually coyotes and bison and whatever else might roam the territory that you're occupying. This is an important idea, though, an important piece of work. And I think for us moving forward, we look at these successional models in three ways. As landscape architects, as people who work with the stuff of landscape, the plants, the animals, the water, the soil, we're very much interested in the mechanics and mechanisms of ecological systems, the literal mechanisms of how these things work and how they change. And yet we're also interested in models or analogies of successional and adaptive systems. And here you think of a number of architectural works that have incorporated adaptive mechanisms within their facade to respond to light conditions or many other pieces of work. We're also interested in successional models in terms of larger scale managerial frameworks for large scale systems, large scale cities, large scale landscapes. And it's working at these three levels, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes one at a time, that we find a lot of potential in terms of searching for ways of thinking through these projects which we don't have full control over. And so this is all at the back of our thinking. We're also quite interested in understanding how we might appropriate the tools of engineers and technicians to think more broadly and yet more precisely about dynamic large-scale landscapes. You're looking at the work of Kelly Doran on a project he did at the University of Toronto, looking at the potential for bringing new agendas to remediation technologies. And we also are interested in thinking more flexibly, even provisionally, as we reimagine the futures of the urban and metropolitan landscapes we engage. The promise here is that such an open-ended approach yields new types of open space, landscape, infrastructure, and urbanistic strategies that address multiple functional, fiscal, and social cultural goals simultaneously. The strategies must be grounded in the particularities of local conditions, yet they're inventive and thickly layered in order to tap into broader trends and larger systems. And they privilege a regenerative approach to civic space, civic projects, and urban landscapes as complex, living, and evolving entities, socially, ecologically, and fiscally robust. All right, so with that as an introduction, I want to show you 4 projects of increasing scale and complexity. Start out really simple, and we'll get more complex as we go along. The first one is a simple park project. It's one of the dumbest projects that we've got in the office. It's one of the dumbest projects you can have. It's here along a river. It's 2.5 acres. I don't mean that pejoratively. I think it's good to be dumb sometimes. We're right along the Bass River. This is a river that drains toward the ocean to the south here. And yet it's also susceptible to fluctuating tidal conditions. We're that close to the seashore. The project is a study in how we put in play ecological dynamics. This is when we're using the simple mechanisms of plants to see what kind of open-ended project we might be able to implant on the site. The site's dead. It's dead flat. It's an old salt marsh that was filled in, to accommodate new commercial activities. Those commercial activities have been removed, and we've got this pancake of a site with little or no social life, little or no ecological life. So the question became how to regenerate that. Excellent. Will you come back often?
Please, just that once.
Feel free. It's nice to be tended to. All right, where were we? Yeah, dead. Okay, dead flat, right? How do you re-inaugurate ecological dynamics on a site like this, compacted and flat? To do so, we established a varied landscape field, an earthen carpet of hillocks, in order to establish physical variation, low to high, wet to dry, sheltered to exposed. Across this carpet, then, we deploy 4 vegetal communities, 3 indigenous, 1 specially adapted to deal with some of the pollutants running off from the adjacent roadway. We deployed these across the carpet in order to spawn short and long-term competition across the site, and to produce a landscape in flux capable of responding to changing environmental and management inputs through time, subtly or radically shifting the balance among vegetal types, and allowing one or another community to establish predominance, if only temporarily. So the idea is really simple. You take the site, you expand the range of conditions on the site, you throw 4 plant communities out there, and you let them compete over time. However, the character of the park will be dependent on the environmental inputs to the park as they play out over the time, or even, in this case, administrative inputs. Here you can see it actually going into the ground. This is going to be an interesting test. It's quite unusual that you get a public client to allow you to test what's a somewhat radical idea on a site, but we're going to do it. Onto this, then, we overlay a series of active surfaces, a boardwalk, a parking event field, and a path network. The boardwalk's quite interesting. It's quite instrumental. It's an 18-foot arc that essentially mimics the shoreline of the park. And yet it's varied by the way both existing natural resources and new hillocks cut into it. And so along this length, you get a lot of variation from something that is really starts out as quite simple, a boardwalk along the edge of the river. This is supposed to be done next week. I'm not sure they're going to make it. We also incised onto the park this incredible series of meandering paths, more paths than you need, more paths than you can imagine. And again, the idea was to simply create variation, to create choice for people who are experiencing these places so that they can simply move around and through this incredibly varied landscape. The idea here is to create a very diverse, active waterfront and upland, rendering the landscape surface as multi-dimensional, high-performance living skins. A new ecological park which sparks and hosts active ecological dynamics in response to larger environmental and bureaucratic changes over time. Very simple, right? Throw some plants out there, see what happens. The second project's on the riverfront in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And whereas the first project was all about soft ecologies, here we're adapting those ideas about diversity to a more highly constructed urban waterfront. We're interested, rather than sparking so much ecological life and dynamic here, to think about how similar ideas of diversification might spawn new social occupations along the waterfront. The riverfront was once quite active. It was a portage area. Lumber coming in from the hinterland was transferred onto boats here, put out to the Great Lakes. Fantastic waterfront conditions all the way along here. You have you have streets that go right down to the water. You have soft edges. You have elevated edges. You have edges that go, wharves that go right out over the water. Fantastic diversity here. You've got commercial uses, industrial uses. You've got recreational uses right in the center of the river there. There's a little boy sailing his boat with his dog. Incredible life here, quite diverse. And this is what it looks like when we started a couple years ago. It's quite dead. In fact, you can see here along the waterfront in question, most of the city has turned its back on the waterfront. The big yellow buildings, a warehouse that's empty and closed. This is the heart of Green Bay, Wisconsin. This is a place which hosts an NFL football team, and there's only 100,000 people, and then you go down to its center and there's really nothing here. There's nowhere to get down to the water. There's no way, once you're in the water or on a boat, to get up to the city. And so the question became, how might we think through the very simple moves to activate this waterfront? Now, it looks like a simple place, but like many urban waterfronts, it's really quite complex. It's built over a series of foundations. It is composed, the wall itself is composed of about 8 different wall segments built at different times with different structural foundation and anchoring systems. And so there's a lot of physical stuff, utilities, storm water pipes beneath the ground that we needed to navigate. But there are also a whole series of regulatory overlays as well, and that's part of what we attempted to depict here. The lines of the federal shipping channel. This is a working waterfront. There are these boats that are half as long as the distance between the 2 bridges that come in here delivering coal and other goods. There are requirements for fire access. There are new requirements for flooding. Anything built right near to the river needs to achieve certain elevations so as not to flood. And so what we've got is a very complex set of conditions, physically varied, and quite difficult to navigate if what we're trying to achieve is a very simple plan, a very simple idea. What we needed was a system that could be deployed flexibly here and then could be configured in different ways in order to attract people for different kinds of uses over different time periods. And so we started out very simple. It's a riverfront. We put in a boardwalk. But then we take this wood surface and we begin to fold it, developing a highly articulated wooden surface that carefully and consciously negotiates this infrastructural landscape of physical, environmental, and code complexities, and then responds to the need for social and cultural reactivation. The goal here is to counter the homogeneity of the current waterfront. The first obstacle, though, was that bulkhead wall. To tear down that wall would immediately start this project off with an $8 million price tag. So we needed to avoid doing that. So at this point, the undulating surface folds up and over the existing bulkhead wall, rising to form overlooks like this and lookouts, and then tumbling down to the water edge as slopes, steps, gathering spots, and river access points. At the city edge, the surface folds up again here as we approach the buildings. Affording these adjacent buildings required protection from flooding and creating retail and dining terraces, seating, and communal chaise lounges looking out to the water. And so every time there's a regulatory constraint, we make it into a programmatic opportunity. The benches themselves are a system of steel truss and wood plank bench sections that allow for variability, for choice, while also allowing for construction and budgetary efficiencies. Apparently in Green Bay, they dress like this year-round. Here's one of the places where it's folding up to accommodate the flood elevations in a raised terrace next to what will be a new building project. The Rail 2 is quite unique. It's quite variable. The idea here was that there are so many different underlying conditions that we needed a system that we could change out parts as we encountered some of these conditions during construction. And so in this case, we have a series of uprights that are designed to be out there, but we can change those parts out without there being a noticeable effect on the overall condition. The structures themselves utilize parallel wood decking set perpendicular to the river in the primary direction of travel that fold up and over underlying structures to establish a highly variable skin physically and programmatically and to reinforce the project's continuity and fluidity. Some of these spaces are quite informal, like the urban beach. The mayor has this idea that there's a new call-in center that's located downtown. He has this idea that everybody that works there are women, that they're all about 22 years old, and that during the summer they're all going to come down here, eat their lunch in their bikinis on the waterfront. I fully support this vision. And if it's what gets the mayor to get this thing built, that's great. Others are less informal, say. And here you can see images from the last month or two of some of these big things going in over the water. You can see some of the edges being articulated here. This project, too, will open in about 3 weeks. Or so they say. So again, the project focused on this highly articulated surface that responds to regulatory requirements and programmatic desires simultaneously and constructively in order to catalyze the social, cultural, ecological, and economic regeneration of a civic waterfront. It's the downtown activation, social and programmatic activation, but thought of in ecological terms, which valued diversity, flexibility, variability, and adaptability. All right, now we're getting up in scale. This is a 200-acre project in the middle of Portland, Oregon. These are Mount Tabor reservoirs built on a volcano in the middle of the city. This is a drinking water reservoir with drinking water that's been cleaned and is ready to be piped to people's homes. We were brought in as one of 4 teams to speculate on what to do about this project. It started as an infrastructure project, and it started when the Water Bureau in Portland decided that after 9/11 that Portland, Oregon was the next target of international terrorism, and that they were coming here. And so they decided secretly that they needed to bury the drinking water reservoirs that were there. Well, I don't know if you know Portland that much, but it's a very activist community, very left, lots of hippies. And public process is everything there. Nothing is done in that city without years of public process. And so, you know, the Water Bureau was sort of doing this secret study and not engaging the public, and then the secret leaked and people got pissed off and said, well, how can you considered this, this is a much beloved urban treasure. It's a neighborhood treasure. You can't touch anything here. And it created quite an uproar. And so the water people turned to the parks people. The parks people were the ones who do all this public process and said, you know, can you help us out? They said, great, we'll run a design competition to see who can make the prettiest top to the boxes that you're putting underground. And it was under those terms that we were invited to go there to help them figure out this problem. Because their idea was, if you can make a pretty top to the infrastructure box, that will quell the public uproar. It was all about the kind of image of the place. And so we were one of 4 teams that went there. We were happy to go. We even got paid a little bit of money to do it, to begin to really think through what could happen here. And it's a great system. We immediately said, you know, this is nice, but let's put the brief aside. Let's figure out what this project is really about. And so, you know, it's a drinking water reservoir. We started looking at the drinking water infrastructure, which is quite interesting. It's a purely gravity-fed system that starts out at Mount Hood somewhere and simply runs downhill all the way through the city. It's cleaned by the time it gets to this place, and then it's either piped out to neighborhoods right around here, or you can see in the plan, it goes downhill underneath the Willamette River and back up to a ridge across the way, again, not using a single pump. So it's an amazing system. There's a lot of head on this water. And, you know, it's actually quite a lovely place, right? Lots of intimate, quiet, reflective places. This is a place where on the 3 days a year that it's not foggy and cloudy and rainy in Portland, you can see downtown, you can actually see Mount Hood. So, you know, it's quite a wonderful place. The other thing is that the infrastructure here is turn of the 19th century. It looks stone, but it's early concrete. So the monuments are actually quite interesting themselves. And yet, as we began to get into the project, we discovered that it's rife with problems. This nice little picture, this nice tale that we were being told by the city really didn't hold. The park itself is problematic. It's overly maintained. It has many, many erosion problems. It has many, many access problems. This was a park that hasn't been touched in probably over 60, 70 years. So handicap access isn't integrated at all here. The plants that do exist are those green things up above. That's an invasive vine. They provide good habitat for urban rats. Which then consequently chase away all the birds and the other stuff that you'd like to see in a place like this. The budget was problematic. We asked them, you know, you've given us the $13.7 million budget. What does that mean? How was that generated? And we were told, well, you know, it's just a piece of a larger hundreds of $million project initiative that essentially is going to go back to the taxpayers. It'll be taxed on their water bill. But our $13.4 million chunk, they said, well, what you can do is you can take this historic infrastructure away, build the box, put this stuff back in its existing condition, and walk away. And we're thinking, you know, do you put the weeds back? Which parts of this dilapidated thing do you put back? Or you could take that away and make this pretty cap that they were interested in having us do. And so there, you know, we immediately started to struggle because there wasn't nearly the amount of money available for the project that would meet their goals. And yet it was set within the context of a project that had a much larger budget and again, which was receiving a lot of negative press from taxpayers. We were also walking around the park and we saw these signs, Save the Reservoirs, Join the Friends. And we asked the city, you know, who are these people? And they said, oh, don't worry about them. And I said, well, you know, there are a few signs up around the park, you know. Yeah, you'll see them tonight at City Hall. They'll be picketing, they'll be protesting. In fact, there were picketers outside. One of them even had one of the names of the other competing firms on it, which I thought was pretty good PR. If somebody wants to get pissed off at me and put my name out on the city street, that's okay. But we came home and we went to their website, friendsofthereservoirs.org, and discovered that these people are very, very well organized and, more importantly, very, very well funded. And being Portland, it's socially activist. So twice a year they hold this Hands Around the Reservoir event, and they all go and hold hands and sing Kumbaya and take pictures and all this other stuff. So you know, we're thinking, how can you ignore that? I mean, you know, okay, it's a little hippie and all, but on the other hand, there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of money there. Why would you just want to turn your back on these people, or these multiple organizations of people? We also, in sort of expanding the purview of the brief, just started to look around. We caught some chatter one day on the web about some birders. Birders, you know, birders, glasses. They're odd people, right? And this was before Twitter and all that other stuff. What they would do is they would see a bird, get really excited, and go home and send somebody an email about this other bird being there, and then all their friends would come out and chase the bird away. And again, we thought, you know, there aren't many birds here because the habitat value was limited, but there are birds and there are people who are chasing after birds. And we thought, you know, again, here are some constituencies, here are some issues that aren't being brought to the table that we think could be interesting as we begin to expand the purview of the project. So essentially, we took the brief and threw it away. We said, you know what, this project goes far beyond the simple decorative landscape cover that they want us to make. And we started to think about the various components of what might make a more robust project. Our goal then was to strategically and structurally catalyze renewal and regeneration of a newly hybridized open space, infrastructure, and ecological resource that would then play out through time. To do this, we had 4 strategies. Physical strategies. These are minimal incisions and constructions that would spark change, altering the dynamics of people, water, and plants and animals on the site. Very, very simple, very much in the spirit of the first project. You take a steep slope, you add something on the hillside, you intercept water, an available resource, plants begin to grow, and you can begin to develop over time a much more vibrant and robust ecosystem. On flatter slopes that were being overly maintained, you could do a simple cut-fill operation. You could begin to create places for birds and places for people and dogs in conjunction with one another, but separated from one another, so that each of those entities had their own place. The interventions were quite strategic. We weren't interested in remaking the entire ground here. And some of these terraces were thickened in order to accommodate social programs that would come. We weren't quite interested in determining every single piece of social program. We thought those activities would emerge over time. And so you started with an existing condition, worked strategically, and essentially grew a landscape. Hydrologic strategies manipulated water flows and processes. They altered how plants grow and adapt, and how humans and animals may come to inhabit successional environments. So what looks here very much like the drinking water reservoir that we started with is actually quite complex. This is a wetland habitat perched atop an underground drinking water reservoir. In this case, we said, great, build your box. We'll give the engineers something. Build the box underground. In the meantime, what we'll do is capture storm water from the park. We'll filter it through a whole series of stormwater terraces, cleaning that water up to a level where it could support a good habitat. And so the water you see here, we retain some of the historic infrastructure, took parts of it away, but created this new dynamics wetland condition. We also began to look more critically at other parts of the program as well. This is the upper reservoir. We also had a series of outlets that would bring water down to the lower reservoir. Part of that was to install in one of those basins a rubber bladder system. So this is a system developed by Arup in Australia. And rather than taking down one of the basins that was there, building a box and putting that stuff back, we could essentially develop a rubber bladder system to be fitted into the existing basin. That would have a lower layer of rubber, an upper layer of rubber, and drinking water in between. On top of that, you could then put a foot or two of non-drinking water to recreate the reflecting pool that the neighbors were interested in maintaining. This was a strategy that saved millions of dollars to the bigger capital infrastructure budget. And would either free that money up or at the very least, make people less pissed off that they were being charged to do this work. And then on the lower reservoir, in the second tank, this was a reservoir that was being decommissioned, and so we took the opportunity to simply open up that to human occupation, swimming in splash pools, to actually get down into this place and occupy this piece of historic infrastructure. Runoff from that system could then be taken to the southern part of the park, used for irrigation for an on-site nursery and ball fields. So we greatly diversified the sets of water systems on the site. Implementation strategies. Here we took on the role of project producer or project curator. These strategies stage events and minimal deployments in early phases of the project that would ignite interest in the project and set off processes of change in order to yield greater results. They also, later on, would facilitate future succession and evolution, allowing for adaptation to future inputs. And so, while stage one was the budgeted phase of landscape development, we developed a pre-stage in order to get people excited, and in order to deal in a very simple way with some of the simple problems on the site. One of the issues was these historic pump houses, which were not being used anymore. They weren't part of the system anymore. And they were these little gems scattered throughout the park, and everybody had ideas about it. Let's make a disco, let's make a nightclub, let's make a bar, cocktails, I'm all for it. Let's make a place for the birders, an Audubon Society kind of thing. And yet that was one of the most expensive things that you could do early on, and so we decided let's defer those projects, but at the same time, here you can see down into one of them. They were all boarded up. And so we said, defer the bigger project, but in the short term, open those projects up, install windows where there were doorways, at least so people could see in, to get people interested in what might be happening here. A very simple set of alterations that would spark a lot of interest in the project. Likewise, on these steep slopes that were being overly maintained, by deploying a series of fence systems, we kept the maintenance people out, which would then allow the grasses simply to begin to grow and recover, creating these great nesting sites for birds and keeping dogs away. Management strategies. Here we become a bit more of the systems manager, thinking about politics, funding and fundraising, and long-term project administration. We're expanding the range of inputs to the project, especially fiscal inputs, opening up new funding and revenue sources through embedded design strategies. We learned through our research that there's actually a program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for neo-migratory tropical birds. The rufous hummingbird, this little bird that everybody got very excited about, turns out it winters down in Central and South America. So by tapping this federal fund for habitat development, we could lessen the cost to local taxpayers and tap into other funding mechanisms. We also looked at installing underground between the upper reservoir and the lower reservoir a series of power turbines that would generate energy. The energy could then be used to power facilities within the park, but they would generate enough energy to then sell back to the power grid, which would then allow for ongoing operations and maintenance and perhaps even future stages of park construction. We got very much into doing Excel spreadsheets, showing how we didn't need all of the money that was being given to us, but could actually embed projects in the smaller scale initiatives in the park that would generate their own revenues. And so at the same time that we're interested in being good social activists and environmental activists, we're also very good at being capitalists as well. And looking at longer term systems where one of the reservoirs that was being commissioned needed to be drained every year, and we said, you know, coordinate that with the wet-dry season and keep it open during the dry season, and you have a fantastic, very large event center embedded right in the middle of the park. So in the end here, our intent was to expand and enhance the social, hydrologic, and ecological dynamics on site, to animate and interact with forces and processes already at work on the ground, and to imagine proposals that are environmentally and socially responsive, hydrologically diverse, fiscally creative, and responsible, a recalibrated and adaptive civic infrastructure. All right, last one. This is super big scale on the waterfront in Toronto. This is a city. So where we get into city building. And for us, it was a real test of a series of strategies that we had been developing and a series of ideas that had been emerging in the last 10 years around this field of landscape urbanism. This was an opportunity to test some of those ideas, though, in a very dense urban condition, utilizing ecology both as a set of mechanisms and as an analog as we begin to reconstitute this place. Fantastic site on the Toronto waterfront. You can see downtown is over there with the big needle. This site was an old Portland's. It was imagined to be this great international hub of shipping that didn't quite come to fruition. It was then imagined to be a Toronto site for the Summer Olympics, which didn't quite come to be. And so it's this place that everybody had a lot of good ideas about, and they never really happened. But it's an interesting site. This was also an invited design competition, and the city was sort of, they didn't know what to do because they, you know, you can see the tangle of infrastructure that marks this place. There are elevated highways. Underneath that are ground level roads and railroad tracks. There are rail yards to the north there. The site is peppered with contaminated properties. And through the middle of it runs this river. Can you see that blue thing? It kind of takes a 90-degree turn. If you know anything about rivers, rivers don't usually do that, right? They sort of meander, right? And so all that infrastructure and that turn caused the river to slow down. It dumps its sediment. The level of the riverbed rises, the water spills out, and there are actually neighborhoods just to the northeast here that are regularly flooded during serious storm events. And so the question here became, how do you unlock the potential of the site? The brief had two goals. One was to restore that river, whatever that meant. And two was to build a city for 20,000 people to live in, to work in, to play in. And so it's quite an ambitious goal. For us, you know, clearly this place was at a crossroads. Here was an opportunity to reestablish the Don River and its marshland as primary forces behind Toronto's emerging waterfront. To this end, we imagine actively inhabiting the dynamic mouth of the Don at a renewed and reestablished ecological interface between river and lake, and at an expanded cultural interface between Toronto and its lakefront. We put the Don River first, allowing the river to shape the metropolis, giving rise to unique, dynamic, engaging, world-class neighborhoods and open spaces, wild river ecologies plus robust urbanism plus resilient vitality, river-city life. Now, historically, the Don River emptied lazily into Ashbridges Bay. Ashbridges Bay is this green blob. This was a big marshland along the waterfront. All the portlands were filled that came later, so this was the edge of the water at that time. You can see the river itself and some of its watershed. It's quite large. Initially, though, the mouth of the Don was in scale and in sync with its valley and its watershed. Currently, though, the mouth has been squeezed into a single tight, hardened channel, and the abundant bay filled for industrial portlands, now largely abandoned. It's out of scale and out of sync. So renewing the Don necessitates reclaiming space for the river and rekindling the delicate dynamics that mark the river-lake interface. In doing so, we must reseed the resilient ecologies of the river and give rise to a new type of urbanism, a green city structured by the river. Now, we also chose to draw on local customs and precedents. A vibrant, rich, ecologically dynamic river does not exclude humans. And in fact, in this place, that was critical. We did not have enough space to reestablish that marshland at the mouth of the river. And so understanding that this was as much an engineered environment as it was a robust ecological environment was baseline for us. And of course, it's a public competition, and so you've always got to have little children. Michael Van Valkenburg, who's a landscape architect in Boston, told me, if you're ever going to win a competition, Chris, you need to make sure that you include little children with red balloons. We found the kids. We don't know where they came from. We thought they were cute, and so you'll see they reappear over and over during the presentation. We also put a dog in. You'll see the dog too. But the question then became, well, if we're going to put the Don first, how do you make a river? How do you make a river? It's not, usually you're sort of working around a river, and we need to figure out, well, how do we figure out how to remake this dilapidated river? This was a critical issue. We needed to understand the dynamics, the ecologies, and the physical needs of the river first. We need to understand its performance criteria, and then use this knowledge as the basis for building viable and vital landscape and urban fabrics. And so we had a team of engineers and ecologists working with us to devise a series of organizing principles and flexible tactics in order to develop this project. So first, amplify the interface. If what we're doing is remaking the mouth of the river where the river hits the lake, what we needed to do is understand, well, what would make for a vital river ecosystem? Here we discovered that fish are a keystone species in helping to build this thriving ecosystem, that the river-lake interface is the richest breeding ground for fish and other wildlife. Fish are the keystone species because then all the other animals eat the fish, and that's what makes for a good environment. And so what would happen is, here's the river, here's the lake, all the fish from the river would come down here to the mouth, all the fish from the lake would come up to the river, and they'd all have sex here. And so what we discovered is that we needed to make the world's largest sex park for fish on the waterfront in Toronto. To do so, we chose to establish the broad estuarine plate that slopes ever so slightly toward the harbor, maximizing the effects of both river and lake fluctuation and ecological resilience. In order to make this breeding ground, we needed to make this incredibly subtly flat place that had a meter of variation over 300 meters of length. And yet the Don remains a highly engineered river within a very constructed environment. By hybridizing the physical parts of the river system, by testing a full range of armored to porous surface conditions, and then by deploying them to form a primary channel, broad marshes, a floodway, and armored uplands, we can set up a framework that both structures and emancipates. Now it's important, these are the component parts of this re-engineered soft river infrastructure. But the deployment of these parts was really quite flexible. If we needed to move parts of the river around because of conditions that we found on the ground, sites that were too highly contaminated, we could do so. The system was flexible. Amplifying and hybridizing yields an extremely dynamic estuarine marsh tuned to both seasonal river events and long-term lake fluctuations. Here we re-inaugurate the dynamics of the disappearing Lake Ontario Lagoon marsh, a marsh characterized by especially resilient plant communities that will move significantly inland in response to both subtle and dramatic fluctuations in lake level. And then the river takes over, spawning successional ecologies in response to short and long-term inputs and seeding new life in the lower Don. Habitat ramps on the edge of the city allow direct access from the urban spits to the river marshland, and they function as ecological reserves that are activated in response to river flooding and long-term lake fluctuations. This is the place where we always had all the plant communities existing along the edge in order to reseed themselves as disturbance events took hold. Even flood control here is an opportunity. River and lake fluctuations put in play a constantly evolving wash of low waters that are amplified by the marsh's shallow grade. The effect around and among the spits, though, is dramatic. Dry one month, entirely inundated the next. The spits can become temporary peninsulas that further emphasize the site's fluid occupations. In taking back its space, the renewed Don becomes a life force once again, giving rise to rich ecological habitat and structuring a unique landscape-based urbanism. And so that's the river, but we also had an incredible lake front as well. Along the lake front was a series of harbor walls that again rendered this potentially dynamic edge as impotent. But by incrementally modifying this harbor wall, we could once again experience a full range of interactions with water, from high perches and overlooks to slopes that kiss the lake, and from soft muddy marsh to intensely urban promenade and marina. In doing so, we could cultivate new lakefront open space types, the soft, ecologically rich lake marsh providing habitat and cleansing water, and the intensely social Channel Basin, used as public pools during the summer, and of course it's Canada, so hockey for 10 seasons out of the year. On this foundation then, we overlay all the stuff that comes along with the city. We overlay a network of working open spaces that both activate and extend the site's industrial and riverine legacies. The Don Sports Park, a new regional recreation destination for sports enthusiasts, negotiates a landscape of infrastructure and work, functions as a huge stormwater cleansing machine, and also provides flood protection for the neighborhoods and a depository for construction debris for the site at large. Rock Island is rendered a large open space and enormous voids situated within, yet strangely apart from both the city and river around it. Here we imagine quiet, lazy days of contemplation, curious meanderings around the ruins of past industrial initiatives, and occasional boisterous gatherings for exceptionally large crowds on the sloping lawn pitched toward the harbor, and cute dogs. But the brief didn't end there. We were also asked to provide over 11,000 new residential units and 1.5 million square feet of commercial institutional space. To do this, we At a smaller scale, we started to think of organizing units as the urban courtyard and as the landscape edge, rendered as active thresholds between the built and landscaped environments. Around the courtyard, we developed, with Brown and Story architects, 11 modified building typologies: low, high, small, large. Each behaves according to a set of rules. They incorporate variety in scales and heights and patterns, flexibility of form to allow for special relationships to open spaces, flexibility of ground plane to develop mixed-use programming, and a full range of residential mixes that include townhouses, apartments, houses, and lofts that can accommodate families, couples, singles, elderly, etc. So the idea is everything from a 3-story townhouse up in the upper left to this guy here in the middle that we call the big boy, this 20-story tower with pieces of building that spanned city blocks. The idea is we could achieve the capacity using a combination of different types of buildings in order to seed into this place a newfound diversity. They were flexible in their possible deployments. Multiple combinations were possible. The frayed edges along the river and marshes let the landscape into the urban fabric. When built in combinations, the building allowed for the flow of landscape across and around the spits and islands. The strong effect of the naturalized landscape sets up a new openness in the building typologies, a permeability of light and space that puts the building landscape dialogue into play. Landscape even turns up the face of buildings, rendering buildings as wildlife habitat, as high-performance green machines. We introduced new landmarks like the mouth of the Don Bridge, which carries vehicular, rail, and pedestrian traffic over the lower Don on separate travelways, each of which flexes independently as it crosses the Don and allows users of each of these modes of transportation unobstructed views of the lower Donlands and Toronto Harbour. We develop a series of integrated multimodal transportation networks, multiple streets, multiple systems, great streets that serve to link existing neighborhoods back to the lakefront and to frame neighborhoods yet to come. So first the river spits and flood control and expanded lakefront, open spaces that work, robust neighborhoods, river city destinations and routes. This is the new green city, diverse, robust, high density, and hybridized, a new metropolitan district structured by the river and engaged in the rich dynamics of the emergent city. River, city, life, a renewed lower Don. Now, for us, these projects and discoveries point toward a new model for landscape design and urbanistic practices, with a new emphasis on the operational and performance-driven aspects of civic and ecological life. Here we focus on birth processes and generative strategies, on project logistics and component mechanisms, on implementation dynamics, on maintenance and management regimes, on frameworks for succession and adaptation. I believe the potential here is to bring a renewed primacy to landscape and landscape practices as a generator and instigator of contemporary civic life. Landscape as process, landscape as infrastructure, landscape as social fabric, landscape as urbanism. Thanks.
Chris has agreed to take some questions. Following the questions, I'd like to invite everyone to our reception here in the hallway where we can continue the discussion.
Great. What do you got?
I was just wondering, what kind of, the tools that you develop to work on these projects, are they able to transfer over from project to project, or is each environment that you work in, do you find them very, very unique, and they aren't even able to shift the design?
I think the approach is similar. I think many of the tools are similar. The individual techniques vary, and the individual issues that are put into play vary. But I think what we try to do is to engage many more issues within the project than are put on the table for us. We're looking to diversify the range of inputs, whether they're the range of stakeholders that are brought to the table, or the range of ecological issues, cultural issues, social issues that are put into play. So we're constantly expanding what the brief is, but we're doing it in tune with what's happening on the ground. Sussing that out sometimes is challenging, but you know, we tend to engage in a very open-ended process of research and exploration early on in order to put as many different issues on our plate to see what sticks as the project may work itself out.
Building on what you were just commenting, thank you so much for the lecture. Very nice. This search for difference, right?
Yeah.
It's perhaps a certain reaction to the Waterfront project that was trying to build certain ideals.
Sure.
And that was almost a cause-effect response towards the mapping of certain subjects or certain problems in the city. This search for expansion of the boundaries or the constraints, could it be a way of escape without like a horizon in front of us? Because when we see these tools or these methodologies of implementation, where do we end? Or where do we finish? When we talk about performance, right? The performance is a gradient of possibilities. But we don't like to find the extreme. We don't like where the ideological horizons frame those aspects. And I'm just asking you if you have been thinking of that in relationship to a much more modern, ideal, principle-based way of approaching the design process towards something that tries to dissolve itself without compromising many of the ideas that are being exposed.
Well, I think you're right. In some ways, it can be seen as a reaction to a modernist agenda, but I also think it's a reaction to a postmodernist agenda as well. I think what we're looking for in these projects are ways to really tap into sets of dynamics that may be present. I think that in many ways, what we're turning toward are advances in other fields like ecology that we think set new grounds for how to think about the city. And so it's not so much that we're simply reacting against something, but we're finding new ways of thinking in allied professions that might help influence how we begin to retool the contemporary metropolis. Stan Allen talked about these as material practices. He talked about engineering and ecology. For us, I think there's something in getting down to the fine-tuned requirements and mechanics of these other sciences and these other systems that allow us to engage those systems, engage that type of thinking, and bring it to bear in design practices. Partially answers your question. You're probably have a much brighter way of framing it.
I mean, I think you made a very good explanation of the sources of generation of form. But there were some moments, right, where, for instance, in the Waterfront project, where the girls would go and have their lunch, right?
Yeah.
Where we had the little sectional development of all the different possibilities of ground, shifting ground. It was almost a work in the oblique. And it was interesting to see how informed or non-informed those shapes were in relationship to what they were actually doing, how they were performing. Right? They look at like the hand drawing in relationship to the car and the arrows. It's a very precise subject. And in your case, I think sometimes you're seeing shifting the subject from the user towards the material that you're working, and as you just explained, right? You shift from certain notions of the user, sometimes the material talking, sometimes the site talking, sometimes the user talking.
Yeah, and sometimes, particularly in that project, some of the occupations that we imagine, some of the manipulations that we do, are really quite specific because we can imagine what people might do here. And others are much more open-ended. I mean, we can begin to imagine certain occupations, and yet we don't care to try to determine and define all of those. Form is important. I downplay that. Because I'm not interested in just open-ended systems that sort of turn into mush over time and don't have a kind of physical formal resolution to them. But I'm more interested in what those forms do than in necessarily the purely sculptural qualities of what those forms are. Yeah?
I guess I would follow up with this discussion, another sort of question, which is, it seems that there's, this is common to many of your contemporaries other landscape urbanists, who consider themselves to be as such, or have been labeled as such. So it seems, I think it's very key what you mentioned about defining the new ground on which to operate. There has been this very finely tuned project that's been the landscape, it is the landscape urbanism project, right? The setting up this new ecological, contemporary, political, social ground upon which we will operate, and I think it's interesting now for those of us who are coming into the profession, because we're now kind of standing on the shoulders of this work, and we can sort of start to think about, now that the ground is set, can some of these things be taken as a priori operating modes that we can assume going into a project, and then therefore, where do you think that things are going now, I guess?
Well, I think there's a lot of testing and refinement and even evolution of these ideas that has yet to take place. And whether or not the landscape urbanism moniker holds is up for grabs. I don't care what people call it on the one hand, but I think one of the things that we've tried to do from the start is to test a series of ideas that were being written about and developed, and to take opportunities to test them in real environments. On the one hand, a lot of the ideas are very conceptual, theoretical, and yet on the other hand, they're very pragmatic. When we encounter a set of clients, a set of constituencies, a lot of these bigger ideas about how you engage multiple voices, how you set up frameworks for project processes or management strategies, which may play out over time under the guidance of people other than yourself, people in the community, people, the various political and social constituencies that you're engaging. I think there's something very real, there's something very appealing to real-world clients about that not everything needs to be a top-down set of operations. The Portland project is a good testament to that. It was very much a top-down. We did not win the project. They picked a pretty box. And in fact, the whole project collapsed after that because the top-down system didn't work. It could not accommodate these other inputs. And so I think at the one hand we're dealing with some bigger ideas, and yet as they play themselves out on the ground, they're very pragmatic and appealing to the people who are living in the environments that we're essentially playing with. Yeah.
What is the attitude of your clients towards the issue? And I'm thinking of time specifically when you think about the performance of these interventions over kind of longer spans of time, when you actually start to have to take account of decay, degradation, a lot of kind of unpredictable reconstitutions of that landscape. And I'm curious how this kind of plays out in dealing with these various projects in terms of how receptive are your clients towards this kind of longer span, and how do you also project that?
I think when you're sitting with a client, they don't want to necessarily hear how their project could completely decay. in the next couple of years. But on the other hand, as you show them, well, you know what, in cash-strapped towns, long-term maintenance of some of these facilities is already very low and will continue to get lower. And so the idea that you have a park that might evolve on its own and might sustain itself without heavy maintenance, without heavy intervention, does have a certain appeal. It has a very pragmatic fiscal appeal. We don't have to pay money. This thing will simply play itself out. And in fact, we're constantly, we never show the clients the ones of absolute decay, where in this case the Cedars take over, or in a project in Milwaukee where nobody uses the space, and then who gets out and starts to take over the plaza. That the mayors don't like to talk about that stuff, but the fact is that we've programmed into these that ability. That we've programmed in the ability for the landscape to change itself is very much appealing. And we go in that response, in that way, being very forthright. This little plaza in Milwaukee that I didn't show, we had no idea who would use this plaza. It was way at the end of the city. There weren't any neighbors. There was no urban fabric there. And so how you program it, who this thing was for, was very much up for grabs. That we gave them a design that might accommodate different future users, whether those users are people or animals or plants, had some appeal to them. Anything else? You guys are easy.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Thanks.